Hey guys, tonight we're exploring the concept of the mask. Not a physical one, but the invisible mask of normalcy that can conceal a nature so twisted, it defies our understanding of what it means to be human. We often imagine monsters as looking like monsters, as figures lurking in the shadows. But the most terrifying stories are often about the monsters who walk among us in the daylight, the ones who share our homes, our workplaces, and our daily routines. They are the coworker who makes you a cup of tea, the quiet neighbor, the seemingly ordinary family member. The cases we'll be delving into tonight are about the shocking revelation that occurs when that mask of normalcy is finally peeled away, revealing the profound darkness that was hiding in plain sight all along. These are stories that force us to confront the unsettling reality that evil doesn't always announce itself with a roar. Sometimes, it whispers from across a dinner table or from the cubicle next to you. Before you get comfortable, maybe take a moment to think about the everyday acts of trust we all engage in without a second thought. Accepting a drink from a friend, eating a meal prepared by family. It is in the violation of that fundamental trust that these stories find their chilling power. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you're ready to look behind the mask. And as always, please let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from. It is a profound experience to see our community of late-night historians gathered from all corners of the globe. Now, let the quiet settle in. Let's begin tonight's journey into the chilling world of the monster next door. The case of the teacup poisoner. The suburbs of London in the post-war era were a landscape of quiet, determined normalcy. In neighborhoods like Neasden, a working-class suburb in northwest London, life was defined by routine. The daily commute, the evening meal, the familiar comfort of a cup of tea. It was a world of conformity and predictability. It was in this most ordinary of settings that one of Britain's most extraordinary and chilling criminals began his dark work. He was not a brute or a thug. He was a quiet, intelligent, and deeply strange young boy who harbored a secret and deadly obsession. His name was Graham Young. Born in 1947, Graham Young was a peculiar and solitary child from a very young age. He was academically brilliant, particularly in the field of chemistry, but he was socially isolated. He didn't play with other children. Instead, he immersed himself in books. His chosen subjects were toxicology, forensic science, and the lives of famous historical poisoners. He idolized figures like Dr. Holly Harvey Crippen and the notorious Victorian poisoner William Palmer. While other boys his age were collecting stamps or trading football cards, Graham was collecting poisons. He used his advanced knowledge of chemistry and a forged document to purchase dangerous substances like antimony, arsenic, and thallium from local chemists, convincing them he was an older student conducting experiments. His first laboratory was his family's kitchen. His first test subjects were the people who loved and trusted him the most, his own family. In 1961, when Graham was just 14 years old, his family began to experience a series of mysterious and debilitating illnesses. His stepmother, Molly, his father, Fred, and his older sister, Winifred, all began to suffer from the same agonizing symptoms: violent stomach cramps, vomiting, diarrhea, and hair loss. They went to doctor after doctor, but no one could diagnose the strange ailment that had befallen their seemingly normal household. The illnesses would come and go, sometimes severe, sometimes mild. Graham, meanwhile, was meticulously documenting his experiments. He kept detailed journals, noting the specific poisons he was using, the dosages he administered, and the precise effects they had on his family members. He was not acting out of a fit of rage or a desire for revenge. He was acting as a cold, detached scientist, and his own family were the unwitting lab rats in his long-term toxicological study. He would slip the poisons into their food and, most frequently, into the teacups that were a staple of their daily life. The primary target of his experiments was his stepmother, Molly. He seemed to hold a particular fascination with her, or perhaps a hidden resentment. He began to administer increasingly large doses of poison to her, primarily antimony and thallium. Her health began to decline rapidly. She suffered from excruciating pain. Her hair fell out in clumps, and she grew weaker by the day. The doctors were completely baffled, suspecting everything from a rare virus to an unknown form of food poisoning. In the spring of 1962, the experiment reached its horrifying conclusion. Molly Young was rushed to the hospital after collapsing in agony. She died a few days later. The official cause of death was listed as a prolapse of the spine, a complication from a previous injury. No one suspected poison. At his stepmother's funeral, the 14-year-old Graham reportedly showed no emotion, instead showing a detached, clinical interest in the effects of the embalming process. After Molly's death, his father, Fred, continued to suffer from the mysterious illness. He was in and out of the hospital, his body racked with pain that no doctor could explain. Graham's sister, Winifred, also continued to experience bouts of the strange sickness. The Neasden-Bogle, as the mysterious family ailment was nicknamed, was a source of confusion and despair for the family. The truth finally began to emerge not from a doctor or a police officer, but from Graham's own school. His chemistry teacher, a man named Mr. Hughes, became increasingly concerned by his students' brilliant but macabre obsession with poisons. He noticed that Graham was not interested in the standard school curriculum. He was interested only in toxicology and famous murderers. One day, he searched Graham's school desk and found several bottles of poison and detailed notes on their effects. Mr. Hughes immediately alerted the school's headmaster, who in turn contacted the police. The police, initially skeptical that a 14-year-old boy could be responsible for such a thing, brought Graham in for questioning. They also consulted with a psychiatrist. During his interview, Graham Young stunned the seasoned officers. He did not deny anything. Instead, he boasted about his extensive knowledge of poisons. He spoke of his experiments with a chilling intellectual pride, showing no remorse or empathy for the suffering he had caused his family. He admitted to poisoning his father, his sister, and a school friend, but he steadfastly denied murdering his stepmother, a denial that many believed was simply a strategic move to avoid a more serious charge. His father's and sister's bodies were tested, and they were found to contain significant levels of antimony and arsenic. With his confession and the medical evidence, the authorities now knew they were dealing with a teenage serial poisoner, a case almost without precedent. In May of 1962, at the age of 14, Graham Young was arrested. Because of his age and his apparent lack of remorse, he was not sent to a standard prison. Instead, he was declared mentally ill and was ordered to be detained indefinitely at Broadmoor, a high-security psychiatric hospital that housed some of Britain's most dangerous and criminally insane patients. As he was being taken away, a detective reportedly asked him why he had done it. Graham's reply was simple and horrifying. He said he felt a cold, pitiless, compelling power growing within him. For the next 9 years, the teacup poisoner would be locked away from the world, surrounded by psychiatrists and other dangerous inmates. The authorities believed he could be studied, understood, and perhaps even cured. They believed the public was safe from him. They were wrong. Graham Young was not being cured. He was biding his time, continuing his studies, and waiting for the day he would be declared sane and released back into an unsuspecting world. His first reign of terror was over, but his final, most deadly chapter was yet to be written. Graham Young's committal to Broadmoor Hospital in 1962 was seen as the end of a terrifying and bizarre chapter. The public was assured that this brilliant but monstrously amoral boy would be kept securely away from society. Inside the walls of the high-security psychiatric hospital, he became a subject of intense fascination for the medical staff. He was, at 14, the youngest inmate Broadmoor had housed in over a century. The psychiatrists who worked with him were faced with a profound puzzle. A boy with a genius-level intellect who seemed to possess no capacity for empathy. A budding scientist whose only field of interest was the methodical destruction of human life. During his 9 years at Broadmoor, Young continued his macabre education. He devoured every book on toxicology and pharmacology he could get his hands on. He became an expert, his knowledge of poisons far surpassing that of many of the doctors who were treating him. He was a model patient in many ways. He was quiet, cooperative, and engaged in his therapy sessions, impressing his doctors with his intelligence and his seeming progress. He learned to say the right things, to mimic the language of remorse and recovery. He told his psychiatrists that he was cured of his obsession and that he understood the gravity of what he had done. But behind this mask of rehabilitation, his deadly experiments continued. He began to test his knowledge on the other inmates and even on the hospital staff. He would extract cyanide from laurel bush leaves on the hospital grounds and use it to contaminate the food and drinks of those around him. Several inmates and staff members fell ill with the same mysterious stomach ailments that had plagued his family. In 1970, an inmate named John Barrage died suddenly. An autopsy found cyanide in his system, but his death was officially ruled a suicide. Many now believe that Barrage was Graham Young's first confirmed murder victim. A successful experiment conducted within the very walls of the institution meant to contain him. Despite this suspicious death and the recurring illnesses among the population, the psychiatric staff at Broadmoor became convinced that Graham Young was cured. In 1970, after 8 years of confinement, his primary psychiatrist wrote a glowing report to the Home Office, declaring that Young was no longer a danger to others and was ready to be released back into the community. He described Young as being full of plans for the future and having a growing maturity and understanding of his past. It was a catastrophic misjudgment, a failure of the psychiatric system that would have deadly consequences. In February of 1971, at the age of 23, Graham Young was declared cured and was released from Broadmoor. He was a free man. He went to live in a hostel and, with the help of a rehabilitation program, he found a job. The job he found was almost unbelievably inappropriate for a man with his history. He was hired as a quartermaster, a storekeeper, at John Hadland Laboratories, a company in Bovingdon, Hertfordshire, that manufactured thallium-lensed infrared equipment for military use. The job gave him routine access to deadly poisons, including the thallium he had been so fond of in his youth. The company had no knowledge of his past. His criminal record as a juvenile had been sealed. To his new employers and colleagues, he was just a quiet, intelligent, and slightly eccentric young man. Almost immediately after Young started his new job, his old pattern began to repeat itself. His new colleagues began to fall ill with a mysterious and debilitating sickness, which they nicknamed the Bovingdon bug. The symptoms were agonizingly familiar: severe stomach cramps, vomiting, hair loss, and a creeping, painful numbness in the extremities. The first to die was his foreman, Bob Eggle. Eggle had been suffering from the bug for weeks, his health declining rapidly. He died in July of 1971. His death was officially attributed to a rare form of polyneuritis. No one suspected poison. Graham Young, meanwhile, was once again keeping a meticulous record of his experiments. He was the same cold, detached scientist, observing the effects of his work with a clinical curiosity. He took a strange, almost paternalistic interest in his sick colleagues, often offering them a cup of tea to comfort them, the very same tea he had laced with thallium. He would engage the company doctor in long, detailed discussions about the symptoms, showing off his impressive toxicological knowledge and suggesting various obscure diagnoses, all while being the secret cause of the epidemic himself. After Bob Eggle's death, the sickness continued to spread through the storeroom staff. Another of Young's colleagues, Fred Biggs, fell gravely ill. He suffered for weeks, enduring excruciating pain as his body slowly shut down. He eventually died in November of 1971. By this point, nearly 70 other employees at the company had reported suffering from the same mysterious symptoms, though none as severely as Eggle and Biggs. The sheer number of illnesses at a single company began to raise alarms. The management, concerned about a potential environmental contamination, called in public health officials to investigate. They tested the water supply and the air quality, but found nothing unusual. The Bovingdon bug remained a complete medical mystery. The truth finally came to light through Graham Young's own arrogance. The company doctor, perplexed by the strange epidemic and impressed by Young's seemingly encyclopedic knowledge of rare poisons, mentioned the case to the police during a routine chat. The police, in turn, became curious about this brilliant young storekeeper. They decided to do a background check on Graham Young. When they ran his name through their records, the file from his juvenile case at Broadmoor came up. The police were horrified. They realized that the Bovingdon bug was not a bug at all. It was the work of a serial poisoner they had released back into the public just a few months earlier. The police immediately arrested Graham Young at the factory. When they searched his apartment, they found a chilling scene. The walls were adorned with pictures of Adolf Hitler and other Nazi figures. They found his detailed journals, which meticulously documented the poisons, the dosages, and the agonizing effects they had on his named victims, both his family members from years ago and his new colleagues at the lab. The journals were the dispassionate records of a scientist, a man who saw other human beings as nothing more than test subjects. They also found a large stash of thallium and other poisons. When confronted with the evidence, Young once again did not deny it. He was proud of his work. He boasted to the police about his superior knowledge, expressing disappointment that the doctors had been so slow to diagnose his thallium poisoning. He seemed almost offended by their incompetence. He confessed to the poisonings of his colleagues, but, just as before, he denied having intentionally killed anyone. He claimed he was only conducting experiments and that their deaths were an unintended, if interesting, side effect. The arrest of Graham Young sent a shockwave through Britain. The story of the teacup poisoner, the brilliant boy who had been cured and released only to kill again, was a major public scandal. It exposed a catastrophic failure in the psychiatric and legal systems, and it raised profound questions about the nature of evil and the possibility of rehabilitation. The public was horrified to learn that a man so clearly and profoundly dangerous had been allowed to walk free and had been given a job that gave him easy access to the very tools of his obsession. The trial of Graham Young was a media sensation. He was charged with the murders of Bob Eggle and Fred Biggs, as well as several counts of attempted murder. His defense team argued that he was mentally ill, that he was not responsible for his actions. But this time, the courts were not so lenient. Graham Young, with his cold, detached demeanor and his proud confession, was seen not as a sick man who needed help, but as an evil man who needed to be permanently removed from society. The boy genius who had fooled a team of psychiatrists had finally run out of tricks. His second and final reign of terror was over. The trial of Graham Young in the summer of 1972 was one of the most sensational legal proceedings of its time. The British public was captivated and horrified by the story of the teacup poisoner, the boy genius who had been released from a high-security hospital only to begin his deadly experiments anew. The courtroom was packed as the prosecution laid out the chilling details of Young's second reign of terror at the John Hadland Laboratories. The centerpiece of the prosecution's case was Young's own meticulous journals. The diaries were a prosecutor's dream and a psychiatrist's nightmare. In cold, dispassionate prose, Young had documented every single poisoning. He noted the dates, the specific poisons used, primarily thallium, the dosages he administered, and the precise physical and psychological effects they had on his victims. He described Bob Eggle's agonizing decline with the detached curiosity of a biologist observing a specimen. He wrote about Fred Biggs's suffering as if it were a fascinating data point in his ongoing research. The journals were an undeniable, self-authored roadmap of his crimes, leaving no room for doubt about his guilt. The prosecution also brought forward testimony from his surviving colleagues, who described the strange Bovingdon bug that had swept through their workplace. They spoke of Young's odd behavior, his unsettling fascination with their illnesses, and his constant presence with a comforting, and as they now knew, a poisoned cup of tea. Young's defense team was faced with an impossible task. They could not deny that he had committed the poisonings. Their only viable strategy was to argue that he was not criminally responsible due to his mental state. They portrayed him as a deeply disturbed individual, a man suffering from a severe personality disorder who was unable to comprehend the moral implications of his actions. They argued that he should be sent back to Broadmoor for treatment, not to a prison for punishment. However, Graham Young himself seemed to actively undermine his own defense. He took the stand and, with a chilling air of intellectual arrogance, seemed to relish the opportunity to display his superior knowledge of toxicology. He sparred with the prosecuting attorney, correcting him on the chemical properties of certain poisons and lecturing the court on their effects. He showed no remorse, no empathy, only a profound sense of pride in his work He came across not as a madman who had lost control, but as a man who was in complete and total control, a cold and calculating killer who enjoyed the power he held over the lives of others. His performance in the courtroom likely sealed his fate. The jury was not swayed by the insanity defense. In June of 1972, they found Graham Young guilty of the murders of Bob Eggle and Fred Biggs, as well as several counts of administering poison with intent to injure. The judge, sentencing him to life in prison, called him a menace to society and recommended that he never be released. He was sent to Parkhurst, a maximum security prison known for housing some of Britain's most dangerous criminals. The case of Graham Young sent a profound shock through the British psychiatric and legal systems. It led to a major public inquiry and significant reforms in how mentally ill offenders, particularly those deemed psychopathic, were managed and released. The case became a textbook example of a catastrophic failure of assessment. The psychiatrists at Broadmoor who had declared him cured were heavily criticized. The case highlighted the immense difficulty in distinguishing between genuine rehabilitation and the clever manipulations of a highly intelligent psychopath who has learned to mimic the language of normalcy. Graham Young spent the rest of his life in prison. He seemed to adapt to prison life with the same detached curiosity he had applied to everything else. He continued his studies of toxicology and was reportedly fascinated by the effects of the various drugs used by other inmates. He became a kind of morbid celebrity within the prison system, the infamous teacup poisoner. On August 22, 1990, Graham Young was found dead in his cell at Parkhurst Prison. He was 42 years old. The official cause of death was listed as a heart attack. However, given his lifelong obsession with poisons, a darker and more fitting theory has always persisted. Many believe that his death was not from natural causes. They speculate that he had either managed to acquire poison in prison and had committed a final, successful act of self-experimentation, or that he had been poisoned by another inmate who had grown tired of his arrogant and unsettling presence. The truth of his final moments remains a mystery, a final, ironic footnote to a life defined by secret, deadly concoctions. The legacy of Graham Young is a chilling one. He stands as one of the most unique and disturbing figures in the annals of 20th century crime. He was not a killer who acted out of greed, lust, or rage in the conventional sense. His motive was a twisted, intellectual curiosity, a purely scientific desire to observe the process of death. He was a scientist whose field of study was human suffering. His story forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about the nature of evil. Was Graham Young born a monster, a person with a fundamental neurological or psychological defect that made him incapable of empathy? Or was he a product of his environment, a lonely and isolated boy whose genius found its only outlet in a dark and destructive obsession? The answer is likely a complex combination of both. He remains a powerful and terrifying example of the monster who hides in plain sight. He was the quiet boy next door, the intelligent student, the helpful colleague. He used one of the most universal symbols of comfort and civility, a shared cup of tea, and turned it into a weapon. His case is a stark and enduring warning that the most dangerous threats don't always come from the dark alleys or the shadowy figures of our nightmares. Sometimes, they come from the person standing right next to you, offering you a cup of tea with a smile. The story of the teacup poisoner is a chilling reminder that behind a mask of perfect normalcy can lie a mind that is cold, pitiless, and lethally compelling. The Man from the Train, the chilling case of Graham Young, is a story about a very specific and intimate kind of evil, the slow, patient, and scientific administration of poison. But some evil is not so precise. It is brutal, explosive, and nomadic. A storm of violence that moves from town to town under the cover of darkness, leaving a trail of devastation in its wake. This is a story about a series of crimes so horrific and so widespread that for over a century, they were thought to be unconnected, a random scattering of local tragedies. But modern investigation has revealed a terrifying possibility, that many of these infamous mass murders were not isolated events, but the work of a single, itinerant phantom, America's first and most prolific traveling serial killer. This is the story of the man who may have been the man from the train. The story begins not with a single crime, but with a pattern, a bloody thread that connects a series of seemingly disparate and infamous mass murders that occurred in the American heartland between the late 1890s and the early 1910s. For decades, these crimes were seen as local horrors, tragedies that belonged to the specific towns in which they occurred. The most famous of these is the brutal axe murder of the Moore family and two young houseguests in Villisca, Iowa, in 1912, a case that has become a cornerstone of American true crime lore. But there were others: the slaying of the Showman family in Ellsworth, Kansas, the murder of the Hagen family in southern Washington, the horrific killing of the Dawson family in Monmouth, Illinois. Each of these cases, and dozens of others like them, shared a series of chilling and remarkably consistent hallmarks. The crimes always occurred in small, rural towns located very close to a railroad line. The victims were always an entire family, killed in their beds as they slept. The weapon was always a blunt object, usually the blunt side of an axe, which the killer would find on the victim's own property, in their woodshed or on their back porch. The killer would then leave the murder weapon at the scene, often leaning it against a wall. The attacks were acts of extreme, almost inhuman violence, a level of brutality known as overkill, where the killer strikes the victims' heads repeatedly, long after they are deceased. But alongside this explosive violence, there were also strange, ritualistic behaviors. The killer would often cover the victims' faces with a piece of cloth or bedding after they were dead. He would also cover any mirrors in the house or turn them to face the wall. He never stole money or valuables, even when they were in plain sight. His motive was not robbery. It was the act of annihilation itself, and after committing his horrific acts, he would simply vanish, presumably by hopping onto a passing train in the dead of night and moving on to the next town, the next unsuspecting family. For a century, these were seen as separate crimes, each with its own set of local suspects and theories. But in the 2010s, a retired law enforcement officer and cold case investigator named Bill James, along with his daughter, Rachel, began a massive, multi-year research project. They used modern data analysis techniques and painstaking archival research to re-examine these historical crimes. They began to connect the dots, identifying the eerie similarities in the killer's methods, the geographical locations along railroad lines, and the precise timing of the crimes. They came to a stunning conclusion: that many of these infamous murders were not committed by different local killers, but were the work of a single, terrifying individual, a nomadic serial killer who had prowled the American railway system for over a decade, leaving a trail of butchered families in his wake. They called him the man from the train. The scope of his potential crimes is staggering. James and his daughter have linked him to as many as 14 separate family massacres, which would make him responsible for the deaths of nearly 100 people. If their theory is correct, the man from the train would be, by far, the most prolific and terrifying serial killer in American history, a monster who operated for years without anyone ever realizing he was a single entity. The investigation into the identity of this phantom has focused on trying to find a single suspect who fits the timeline and the geographical pattern. The most compelling candidate, and the one that Bill James believes is the likely killer, is a man named Paul Mueller, sometimes spelled Miller. Mueller was an immigrant, likely from Germany or Austria, who had worked as a lumberjack in the forests of the northern United States and Canada. He was a powerful man with a reputation for a violent temper, particularly when he was drinking. The first crime that he was definitively linked to occurred in 1897, in the small town of West Brookfield, Massachusetts. A farmer and his wife were brutally murdered with an axe in their home, which was located very near the railroad tracks. A German-speaking immigrant who had been working as a farmhand in the area, and who was known to have a violent temper, was the primary suspect. He vanished immediately after the murders. A year later, in 1898, a similar crime occurred in the town of Arden, Washington. The Hagen family was murdered in their beds with an axe. The crime shared many of the same hallmarks: the use of the family's own axe, the covering of the faces, the proximity to a railroad line. A man named Paul Mueller was arrested for this crime. He was an itinerant lumberjack who had been working in the area. He was convicted of the murders and sentenced to prison. However, the evidence against him was circumstantial, and he was later released on a technicality after an appeal. After his release, he vanished. It is after this point, in the early 1900s, that the series of brutal, unsolved family axe murders began to accelerate across the Midwest and the South. The timeline of these murders seems to follow a possible path of a man moving across the country, following the railroad lines, stopping in small towns for a few weeks or months to work, and then, for some unknown reason, being triggered into an act of horrific violence before disappearing again. The profile that emerges is of a deeply disturbed individual, a drifter with no ties and a deep-seated, explosive rage. He was likely a seasonal worker taking jobs in logging camps, farms, or on the railroad itself, which would give him a legitimate reason to be in these remote, rural areas. The crimes always occurred at night, suggesting he was a man who was comfortable in the darkness, a man who could navigate a small town and a family's property without being seen. The psychological motive for the crimes is a subject of intense speculation. The targeting of entire families suggests a deep-seated hatred of the family unit itself, perhaps stemming from a traumatic childhood of his own. The extreme, focused violence on the heads of the victims points to a deep, personal rage. And the strange, ritualistic elements, the covering of the mirrors and faces, hint at a more complex, superstitious, or shame-based psychology. Perhaps he could not bear to see his own reflection, or the faces of his victims, after committing such monstrous acts. He was a killer driven by a powerful cyclical compulsion, a rage that would build up until it was released in a torrent of violence, after which he would become calm again and move on, a human storm passing through the heartland. The theory put forth by Bill James and his daughter Rachel is a stunning recontextualization of a dark chapter in American history. It suggests that while towns like Villisca, Iowa, and Ellsworth, Kansas, were each searching for their own local monster, the real killer was a phantom who was already miles down the railroad tracks, moving toward his next unsuspecting target. The railroad, the great symbol of American progress and connectivity, had been turned into a private highway for a nomadic angel of death. To build their case, the researchers had to do more than just point out similarities. They had to create a plausible timeline and a geographical path that could link a single individual to these disparate crimes. Their work focused on painstakingly tracing the movements of their primary suspect, Paul Mueller, and cross-referencing them with the dates and locations of the murders. While records from the turn of the 20th century are sparse, they were able to construct a compelling, if circumstantial, narrative. After Mueller's release from prison in Washington state, he seems to have vanished from official records. But the trail of bodies continued. The researchers followed the path of the railroad lines eastward and southward. In 1901, a family was murdered in Iowa. In 1904, another in Missouri. In 1910, another in Colorado. Each crime bore the chilling, specific signature. A family bludgeoned in their beds with their own axe, the faces and mirrors covered, the house near a railroad line, and a killer who left nothing behind but the murder weapon and a scene of unimaginable carnage. The most infamous and well-documented of these potential crimes occurred on the night of June 9, 1912, in the small town of Villisca, Iowa. The Josiah B. Moore family, a husband, wife, and their 4 young children, were prominent and well-liked members of their community. That evening, they had attended a Children's Day service at their local church. 2 young friends of the Moore children, Lena and Ina Stillinger, were invited to spend the night. Later that night, as the 8 people slept, an intruder entered their home. The killer picked up the family's axe from the backyard, went from room to room, and systematically bludgeoned every single person to death. The violence was so extreme that the ceiling in the parents' bedroom was gouged by the upswing of the axe. The killer then covered the faces of the victims and the mirrors in the house. The crime was a perfect, horrific execution of the man from the train's established pattern. The Villisca murders became a national sensation and one of the most enduring unsolved mysteries in American history. The local investigation was extensive but ultimately fruitless. Several local suspects were considered, including a traveling preacher with a history of mental illness and a state senator who was a political rival of Josiah Moore. One man, a local eccentric named Frank F. Jones, was even brought to trial, but he was acquitted. The town of Villisca tore itself apart with suspicion and accusations, never considering the possibility that the killer was a complete stranger who had arrived on the 5 p.m. train and left on the 5 a.m. train, a ghost who was just passing through, According to Bill James's research, the Villisca murders may have been the man from the train's final and most audacious crime. Just a few weeks after the Villisca massacre, a man fitting Paul Mueller's description was arrested in another state for a minor offense. This timeline suggests that perhaps the immense publicity and the massive manhunt that followed the Villisca crime had finally made it too dangerous for the killer to continue his spree. He may have been forced to stop, his pattern finally broken by the national attention he had drawn. The primary challenge in definitively proving the man from the train theory is the lack of physical evidence from a pre-forensic era. There is no DNA, no fingerprints to link the scenes. The case is built on the power of pattern recognition, on the almost impossibly consistent details that connect these crimes across a vast geographical and temporal landscape. The signature itself is the most compelling evidence. The use of the family's own X, left at the scene, is a highly unusual and specific behavior. The covering of the mirrors and faces is a strange, psychological ritual that is repeated time and again. The proximity to the railroad lines provides the killer with both a means of arrival and a perfect, anonymous escape route. The targeting of entire families in small, isolated towns also fits a consistent pattern. The odds of dozens of separate local killers, all unknown to each other, independently developing the exact same, highly idiosyncratic method of murder are, from a statistical standpoint, infinitesimally small. It is far more likely that these are the works of a single, migrating predator. The theory also provides a powerful explanation for why so many of these infamous cases were never solved. The local police in these small towns were completely unequipped to deal with a crime of this nature. They were looking for a local suspect with a local motive, a jealous lover, a business rival, a disgruntled neighbor. The concept of a modern, motiveless serial killer, a man who kills simply for the psychological thrill of it, was not yet a part of the American consciousness. The idea that the killer could be a complete stranger who had arrived in town just hours before the crime and had left immediately after was an investigative leap that was almost impossible for them to make. They were searching their own backyards for a monster who was, in fact, a specter of the railway, a ghost who lived on the rails and brought his nightmares with him wherever he stopped. The man from the train was able to exploit the limitations of the era's law enforcement. There was no national police force like the FBI to coordinate investigations across state lines. There were no centralized databases of criminal records. A man could commit a horrific crime in Kansas, hop on a train, and be in Colorado the next day, a completely anonymous stranger with no history. He was a phantom who existed in the cracks of the system. If the theory is correct, then the story of the man from the train forces us to rewrite a significant chapter of American criminal history. It suggests that before the well-known monsters of the 20th century, like Ted Bundy or the Zodiac, there was an earlier, more prolific, and far more terrifying killer who moved silently through the heart of the country. He was a product of his time, a man who used the great, expanding network of the American Railroad not to build a new life, but to systematically destroy the lives of others. The identity of the killer, whether it was Paul Mueller or another, unknown individual, remains a matter of historical speculation. Mueller is a compelling suspect because he is one of the few individuals who was actually arrested for a crime that fits the pattern, and his known history as a violent, itinerant worker aligns with the profile. But without a confession or definitive proof, he remains a ghost, a name attached to a shadow. The true legacy of the man from the train is the chilling realization that some of the most famous unsolved mysteries in American history may not be unsolved at all, but may simply be chapters in a much larger, darker story that we are only now beginning to piece together. It's a story that reminds us that even in the seemingly safe and simple world of the past, a profound and methodical evil could be on the move, a faceless man on a late-night train, searching for the next quiet house by the tracks. The groundbreaking research that identified the potential existence of the man from the train has cast a new and chilling light on a series of historical tragedies. It forces a reevaluation of cases that have been treated as isolated local horrors for over a century. The implications are profound, suggesting a narrative of serial violence that is far more extensive and organized than was ever previously imagined. The theory, while largely circumstantial, provides a powerful and unifying explanation for a pattern of crime that is otherwise baffling in its consistency. One of the most compelling aspects of the theory is how it solves the central problem that plagued the original investigations: the lack of a local motive. In case after case, from Villisca, Iowa, to Paola, Kansas, local police were stumped because they could find no reason for anyone in the community to want to annihilate an entire family. These were often well-respected, church-going families with no known enemies. The search for a local perpetrator with a personal grudge was a dead end because the killer had neither. His motive was not personal revenge or financial gain. It was the act of killing itself, a psychological compulsion that he satisfied by targeting strangers. The families were victims of opportunity, chosen for their vulnerability and their proximity to his escape route. The railroad, this profile of a nomadic, motiveless killer, also explains the killer's apparent ability to vanish. He was not hiding in the community after the crime. He was already gone. By the time the bodies were discovered, often a day or more after the murders, the killer could be hundreds of miles away, a faceless passenger on a train, blending into the anonymous flow of humanity that crisscrossed the nation. He was a ghost because he never stayed long enough to become a person. The theory also shines a light on the social and technological landscape of the era. The turn of the 20th century was a time of immense transition. The railroad had connected the country, but law enforcement was still highly localized. This created a perfect environment for a killer like the man from the train to operate. He could exploit the connectivity of the railway system to move freely, while also benefiting from the disconnectedness of the various police jurisdictions, which rarely communicated with each other about similar crimes in other states. He was a thoroughly modern killer in a pre-modern law enforcement world. While Paul Mueller remains the most compelling suspect, the ultimate identity of the man from the train may never be definitively proven. Mueller's story is a tantalizing one, but it is filled with gaps. Records from that era are notoriously sparse, and tracking the movements of an itinerant worker like him is nearly impossible. He is a strong candidate because he fits the profile and was actually convicted of one of the crimes, but the case against him, like the broader theory itself, remains circumstantial. The legacy of this research is not just about potentially solving these old crimes. It's about changing our understanding of the history of serial murder in America. The common narrative often begins with figures from the mid-20th century, like Albert Fish or Ed Gein. But if the man from the train theory is correct, it pushes the timeline back significantly, suggesting that a far more prolific and systematic killer was operating decades earlier. He was, in a sense, the prototype, a blueprint for the modern traveling serial killer. The story also serves as a somber vindication for the many individuals who were wrongly suspected and, in some cases, persecuted for these crimes in their local communities. In Villisca, for example, the town was consumed by paranoia and suspicion for decades. Friendships were destroyed, reputations were ruined, and innocent men were dragged through the legal system. The man from the train theory suggests that the town's monster was not one of their own, but an outside force, a malevolent shadow that passed through their community and left a permanent scar. The work of Bill James and other researchers has given a new, albeit terrifying, context to these historical tragedies. It connects them into a single, horrifying narrative, a secret history of violence that was hidden in plain sight for a century. The theory is a powerful example of how a fresh perspective and modern analytical tools can be used to re-examine the past and uncover patterns that were previously invisible. Ultimately, the story of the man from the train is a chilling reminder of the darkness that can travel along the arteries of a nation. The railroad was a symbol of hope, progress, and manifest destiny, but it also provided a path for a very different kind of pioneer, a pioneer of methodical, motiveless violence. He was a man who used the great engine of American expansion to fuel his own private, destructive journey. The final question of his identity may remain lost to time. Whether it was Paul Mueller or some other nameless, faceless drifter, the man from the disappearance of Tara Calico, the murders at Lake Bodom are a story of a single, brutal night that left behind a physical scene of carnage and a lone survivor. But some mysteries are not about what is found at a crime scene, but about what is missing. They are stories that begin with the most ordinary of acts, a routine bike ride on a sunny morning, and devolve into a disappearance so profound and a mystery so dark that it leaves behind only a trail of whispers and a single, terrifying photograph that has haunted the public imagination for decades. This is the deeply unsettling and unsolved disappearance of Tara Calico. The autumn of 1988 was a time of quiet normalcy in Belen, New Mexico, a small town nestled in the vast, sun-scorched landscape of the American Southwest. It was a place of wide-open spaces and long, straight roads that stretched to the horizon. It was in this setting that 19-year-old Tara Calico was building her life. She was a bright and ambitious sophomore at the University of New Mexico's Valencia campus, studying to become a psychologist or a psychiatrist. She was known for being energetic, athletic, and fiercely independent. She was an avid cyclist, and her daily bike rides were a cherished part of her routine. On the morning of Tuesday, September 20th, 1988, Tara set out on one of these rides. It was a beautiful, clear morning. She told her mother, Patty Dole, that she was going on her usual 36-mile route along New Mexico State Road 47, a familiar and relatively quiet stretch of highway. She was riding her mother's pink Huffy mountain bike. As her own bike had a flat tire, she was a creature of habit, and her routine was well known. She would ride south on the highway and then turn back, a journey that she had completed countless times before. Before she left around 9:30 a.m., she had a light-hearted exchange with her mother. She joked that her mother should come and get her if she wasn't home by noon, as she had a tennis match scheduled with her boyfriend at 12:30. Patty agreed. It was a simple, loving, and completely ordinary conversation between a mother and a daughter. It was the last one they would ever have. When noon came and went with no sign of Tara, Patty Dole was not immediately alarmed. She knew Tara was a strong rider and might have gotten delayed. But as 12:30 passed, the time of her tennis date, a knot of worry began to form. Tara was responsible. It was not like her to be late without calling. Patty got in her car and began to drive Tara's familiar bike route along Highway 47, scanning the long, empty stretches of road for any sign of her daughter or the distinctive pink bicycle. She drove the route again and again, each pass more frantic than the last. She saw nothing. The road was empty. By late afternoon, worry had turned into full-blown panic. Patty contacted the police and reported her daughter missing. An immediate search was organized. The police and local volunteers began to scour the area along Tara's route. They soon found the first and one of the only pieces of physical evidence ever to be recovered. On the shoulder of the road, about 2 miles from her home, they found pieces of a broken Sony Walkman personal stereo and a cassette tape of the band Boston. Patty confirmed that they belonged to Tara. It appeared that the items had been deliberately crushed. This discovery was chilling. It suggested that Tara had not simply had an accident or gotten a flat tire. It pointed to a confrontation, a violent struggle on the side of the road. As the investigation widened, witnesses began to come forward. Several people reported seeing a light-colored, older model pickup truck, possibly a Ford, driving erratically along Highway 47 that morning. Some witnesses claimed the truck had been following Tara, driving slowly behind her. One witness reported seeing the truck pulled over on the side of the road near where Tara was last seen, with 2 men inside. But the descriptions were vague and sometimes contradictory, and the police were never able to identify the truck or its occupants. The search for Tara Calico became a massive undertaking. For months, search parties on foot, on horseback, and in the air combed the vast, desolate landscape of the New Mexico desert. They searched arroyos, abandoned buildings, and remote, rugged terrain. But the desert held its secrets close. They found no bicycle, no helmet, no clothing, and no sign of Tara herself. It was as if she and her mother's pink Huffy bike had been completely erased from the face of the earth. The formal investigation yielded few leads. The police interviewed Tara's friends, her boyfriend, and her family. They looked into her life, searching for any hidden troubles or secret enemies, but they found nothing. She was a happy, well-adjusted young woman with no reason to run away. Foul play was the only logical explanation, but with no body and no suspects, the case quickly went cold. For Tara's parents, Patty and John Dole, the lack of answers was an unbearable torture. They refused to let their daughter's case be forgotten. They kept her story in the media, offered a reward for information, and became tireless advocates for the missing. For months, their lives were a cycle of hope and despair, following up on every tip, no matter how small or strange, but the trail remained cold. The mystery of what happened to Tara Calico on that sunny September morning was a gaping, painful wound in the community. The case seemed destined to become another tragic, unsolved file, a story of a young woman who had vanished on a lonely stretch of highway, and then, nearly 9 months later and over 1,500 miles away, a discovery was made in the parking lot of a convenience store in Florida that would transform the case from a local tragedy into one of the most haunting and infamous mysteries in American true crime history. A single, terrifying photograph would surface, an image that seemed to offer a horrifying glimpse into Tara's fate, a proof of life that was also a proof of terror. The second act of Tara Calico's story was about to begin, and it would be a journey into a darkness far deeper than anyone could have imagined. For 9 agonizing months, the disappearance of Tara Calico was a mystery defined by a complete and utter void. There were no leads, no suspects, and no new evidence. The case had gone cold, leaving her family trapped in a state of unending, ambiguous grief. Then, on June 15, 1989, a single photograph was found in the parking lot of a convenience store in Port St. Joe, Florida, a small town on the Gulf Coast, more than 1,500 miles away from where Tara had vanished. The discovery of this photo would reignite the case, transforming it from a frustrating cold case into a chilling national sensation. A woman who was shopping at the convenience store noticed a white, windowless Toyota cargo van parked in the lot. She saw the driver, a man she described as being in his 30s with a mustache, get out and go inside. A few moments later, she found a single Polaroid photograph lying face down on the pavement where the van had been parked. She picked it up. The image she saw was so disturbing that she immediately contacted the police. The photograph was a grainy, poorly lit, and deeply unsettling tableau. It depicted a young woman and a young boy lying side by side on what appeared to be a bed of wrinkled sheets or a sleeping bag, inside the dark, cramped interior of a van. Both of them were bound, their hands behind their backs, and their mouths were sealed with black duct tape. They were staring at the camera with expressions of palpable fear and resignation. The young woman was pretty, with dark hair, and the boy looked to be around 9 or 10 years old. The Port St. Joe police had no idea who the two captives were, but they knew the photograph was evidence of a serious crime. They set up a roadblock to try and find the white van, but it was gone. The photo was turned over to the FBI and was broadcast on national news programs and television shows like America's Most Wanted and Unsolved Mysteries. Back in New Mexico, Patty Dole, Tara's mother, was watching one of these broadcasts when the Polaroid photograph flashed onto her screen. Her heart stopped. She was looking at the face of her missing daughter. She was absolutely convinced of it. The young woman in the photograph had a distinctive scar on her leg, identical to one Tara had from a childhood car accident. Lying next to her in the photo was a copy of the book My Sweet Audrina by V.C. Andrews, which was known to be one of Tara's favorite books. For Patty, the identification was immediate and certain. The photograph was a horrifying and deeply ambiguous clue. On one hand, it was a proof of life, suggesting that Tara was still alive in June of 1989, 9 months after she had disappeared. But it was also proof of a living nightmare. She was being held captive, bound and gagged, by an unknown tormentor. The photo seemed to be a deliberate message, a taunt from the kidnapper, carelessly dropped in a public place to be found. It was an act of psychological cruelty, a way of showing the world that he still had her, that she was still his prisoner. The FBI and other law enforcement agencies were more cautious. They sent the photograph to be analyzed by experts at the Los Alamos National Laboratory and by Scotland Yard. The results were inconclusive. While they agreed that the woman in the photo bore a striking resemblance to Tara Calico, they could not definitively confirm that it was her. The grainy quality of the Polaroid made a positive identification impossible. The identity of the young boy in the photograph also became a major mystery. His identity was unknown, and police launched a separate investigation to try and find him. In 1990, the parents of a 9-year-old boy named Michael Henley, who had disappeared on a camping trip in New Mexico in 1988, the same year as Tara, came forward, believing the boy in the photo was their son. For years, it was thought that the two cases might be connected. However, Michael Henley's remains were discovered in 1990 in the Zuni Mountains, not far from where he had disappeared. His death was ruled to be from exposure, and he was not believed to have been a victim of foul play. The boy in the Polaroid remains unidentified to this day. The discovery of the Polaroid led to a flood of new tips and potential sightings. The white Toyota van was spotted numerous times, but it was a common vehicle, and none of the sightings led to a concrete suspect. The case of Tara Calico had become a national obsession, but the investigation was no closer to finding her or her captor. In the years that followed, 2 more Polaroid photographs would surface, both of them even more disturbing and ambiguous than the first. The first was found near a construction site in Montecito, California. It was a blurry photo of a young woman's face, her mouth covered with duct tape, her features obscured by poor lighting. The film used was not available until after June of 1989. Patty Dole believed this was also a picture of Tara. The second photo showed a woman loosely bound in gauze, her eyes covered, sitting on a passenger train next to a man. Again, Patty believed it might be her daughter. But like the first photo, forensic analysis of these 2 subsequent images was inconclusive. They were just more ghostly, unprovable images in a case that was full of them. As the years turned into decades, the case grew colder. But Patty and John Dole never gave up hope. They kept Tara's room exactly as she had left it, waiting for the day she might come home. They moved from New Mexico to Florida, in part because the first, most credible photograph had been found there. They believed Tara might still be alive, held somewhere in the region. The investigation in New Mexico, meanwhile, continued to focus on a few local persons of interest. The theory of the light-colored pickup truck that was seen following Tara on the day she disappeared remained the most promising lead. Police had always suspected that she was abducted by local men who knew the area and could have easily hidden her or her body in the vast, desolate landscape. One theory that emerged centered on 2 local men, both of whom had a history of violence and were known to drive a truck that matched the description. According to this theory, the 2 men had been driving behind Tara and had accidentally or intentionally hit her with their truck. In a panic, they decided to abduct her to cover up the crime. They then killed her and disposed of her body. This theory was bolstered by a witness who claimed to have heard one of the men confessing to the crime. However, the witness was deemed unreliable, and without a body or a murder weapon, the police could not build a case. Another theory involved a group of local boys who were known to be involved in a violent altercation near the abduction site. It was rumored that they knew what had happened to Tara but were too afraid to come forward. This lead, too, was investigated but never led to a resolution. The case of Tara Calico is a story that is defined by its single, iconic, and terrifying piece of evidence. The Polaroid photograph found in the Florida parking lot is one of the most haunting images in the history of true crime. It is a document that seems to offer a definitive answer, that Tara was abducted and held captive, but it ultimately provides no closure. It is a snapshot of terror, frozen in time, a window into a nightmare that has no beginning and no end. For her family, it was both a source of hope and a source of profound, unending pain. It was the hope that she was still alive, and the pain of knowing the horrific circumstances of that life. The photograph turned a missing persons case into a living ghost story, one that has haunted the American consciousness for over 30 years. A chilling reminder of a young woman who went for a bike ride on a sunny morning and peddled into a mystery that may never be solved. The Polaroid photograph, for all its horrifying ambiguity, became the central axis around which the Tara Calico case would revolve for decades. It kept her story alive in the national consciousness, a constant, nagging reminder of a crime that demanded to be solved. But for the investigators on the ground in Valencia County, New Mexico, the photo was both a blessing and a curse. While it generated tips from across the country, it also created a cloud of speculation that often distracted from the more grounded local investigation. The prevailing belief among many of the original detectives was always that Tara's disappearance was the work of local individuals, and that the answer to the mystery was to be found not in a Florida parking lot, but in the dusty back roads and quiet, tight-lipped communities of New Mexico. In 2008, 20 years after Tara vanished, a major development seemed to bring the case back into sharp focus. The sheriff of Valencia County, Rene Rivera, held a press conference and made a stunning announcement. He stated that he knew what had happened to Tara Calico. He claimed to have received credible information from multiple sources that Tara had been accidentally hit by a truck driven by two local young men who knew her. Panicked and possibly intoxicated, they had not stopped to render aid but had instead enlisted the help of other friends to abduct her and cover up the crime. Rivera alleged that they later killed her to ensure her silence and that her body, along with her mother's pink Huffy bicycle, had been disposed of. Sheriff Rivera stated that he knew the names of the individuals involved, who were now middle-aged men, but that without a body, he did not have enough physical evidence to press charges and secure a conviction. He made a public plea to the individuals involved, or to anyone who knew what had happened, to come forward and finally reveal the location of Tara's remains. He believed that the culprits were still living in the Valencia County area, living ordinary lives, burdened by a terrible secret. The sheriff's announcement was a bombshell. It seemed to confirm the long-held theory of a local cover-up. It gave a plausible, if tragic, explanation for Tara's disappearance. However, his statements were met with a great deal of controversy. He did not present any new physical evidence, and his claims were based on witness statements and second-hand information that could not be fully corroborated. The individuals he was implicitly accusing were never named publicly, and no arrests were ever made. For Tara's family, it was another moment of agonizing frustration, to be told that the truth was known, but that justice was still out of reach. The case continued to simmer in the public consciousness. Then, in 2013, another strange piece of a potential puzzle emerged. A report from a dying man, a local resident, claimed that he had been involved in a cover-up related to the case. He alleged that his neighbor, a man with a reputation for violence, had been involved in Tara's death and had buried her remains on his property. This lead was investigated, but a search of the property yielded nothing. It was another dead end, another whisper in a case full of them. The impact of Tara's disappearance on her family has been profound and devastating. Her parents, Patty and John Dole, dedicated their lives to finding her. They kept her case in the media, worked with law enforcement, and never gave up hope. They eventually moved from New Mexico to Florida, believing that the discovery of the Polaroid there was a significant sign. Patty Dole passed away in 2006, and John Dole passed away in 2023, both going to their graves without ever knowing for certain what happened to their daughter. The case is now carried forward by Tara's siblings and a dedicated community of online sleuths who refuse to let her be forgotten. In recent years, the FBI has renewed its efforts, offering a $20,000 reward for information leading to the discovery of Tara's remains or the arrest of those responsible. They have also reanalyzed the original evidence with modern technology, hoping that a trace of DNA might finally provide the breakthrough the case has always needed. The case of Tara Calico is a heartbreaking story that serves as a powerful testament to the torment of ambiguous loss. Unlike a confirmed death, which allows for a process of grieving and closure, a disappearance leaves a family in a state of perpetual limbo. The Polaroid photograph, in particular, is a uniquely cruel artifact. It is a tangible piece of a nightmare, a single frame that confirms the worst fears of abduction and captivity, but offers no narrative, no context, and no resolution. So what is the most likely scenario? The theory put forth by Sheriff Rivera, that of a tragic hit-and-run that escalated into a panicked cover-up and murder, remains the most plausible and widely accepted explanation among law enforcement. It fits the known facts: the debris from her Walkman on the side of the road, the witness sightings of the pickup truck, and the complete disappearance of both Tara and her bike. It explains why local individuals would have the knowledge and the means to permanently hide a body in the vast, unforgiving New Mexico landscape. But the Polaroid photograph remains the great, confounding outlier. If she was killed shortly after her abduction in 1988, as the hit-and-run theory suggests, then who is the woman in the photograph found in Florida in 1989? Was it a case of extraordinary, tragic coincidence, A different young woman who happened to look exactly like Tara and was found with Tara's favorite book? Or was the hit-and-run theory wrong? Was Tara kept alive for at least 9 months by her captor, who then traveled across the country and deliberately dropped the photograph as a taunt? The two scenarios are almost mutually exclusive, and it is this central contradiction that has made the case so difficult to solve. The disappearance of Tara Calico is more than just a cold case. It is a piece of American folklore, a modern ghost story that speaks to our deepest fears. It is the story of a girl who vanished from a sunlit highway, leaving behind only a few scattered pieces of plastic and a single, terrifying image that has been burned into the public's memory. Her case is a powerful reminder that sometimes a photograph does not capture 1,000 words, but only 1,000 unanswered questions. The road where she was last seen is just an empty stretch of highway, but for over 3 decades, it has been haunted by the ghost of a girl on a pink bicycle, a girl who went for a ride and never came home. The Golden State Killer, the case of the lost colony of Roanoke, is a mystery about a community that vanished, leaving behind a 400-year-old question. But some mysteries are not about a sudden absence. They are about a terrifying, prolonged presence. This is a story about a shadow that fell over an entire state, a phantom who, for more than a decade, moved silently through the quiet, suburban landscapes of California, turning the dream of a safe and peaceful life into a waking nightmare. He was a man of many names, the Visalia ransacker, the East Area rapist, the original Night Stalker, but he was a single, methodical monster, a predator who would become one of the most prolific and feared serial offenders in American history. This is the story of the man who would eventually be known as the Golden State Killer. The story begins not with murder, but with a strange and deeply unsettling series of burglaries in the mid-1970s. In the small, agricultural city of Visalia, in California's Central Valley, a prolific and unusually brazen prowler began to terrorize the community. He was not a typical burglar. He wasn't just interested in stealing valuables. He seemed to be driven by a strange, psychological thrill. He would break into homes, often while the residents were away, and he would meticulously ransack them, scattering personal items like women's underwear, but often leaving behind more valuable objects like cash and jewelry. He was a fetishist, a voyeur who seemed to get a charge from invading the most private spaces of his victims' lives. This figure, dubbed the Visalia ransacker, escalated his crimes. He began to break into homes while people were sleeping, a terrifying escalation that showed a new level of confidence. He would stalk his victims for weeks, learning their routines, their habits, the layout of their homes. Then, one night, he murdered a man named Claude Snelling, a local journalism professor, when Snelling interrupted him in the act of trying to abduct his teenage daughter from her own bedroom. The ransacker shot Snelling and vanished into the night. Despite a massive investigation, he was never caught. Then, in 1975, the ransacker's crime spree in Visalia abruptly stopped. It was as if he had simply disappeared. In the spring of 1976, a new reign of terror began, about 200 miles to the north, in the quiet, middle-class suburbs of Sacramento County. A series of horrific home invasion rapes started to occur. The police at first believed they were dealing with a local offender, but they soon realized they were hunting a predator of unparalleled skill and cruelty. This was the beginning of the East Area rapist phase of the killer's career. His method was chillingly consistent and meticulously planned. He would target middle-class, single-story homes, often near a creek bed, a bike path, or another easy escape route. He would stalk his victims for weeks, sometimes months, learning every detail of their lives. He would make silent, hang-up phone calls to their homes, sometimes for months in advance, just to hear their voices and learn their schedules. He would sometimes break into their homes days before the attack, not to steal anything, but simply to learn the layout, to unlock a window, or to move things around, a subtle act of psychological warfare designed to unnerve them. When he finally decided to strike, he would do so with a terrifying efficiency. He would enter the house in the dead of night, usually between midnight and 4 a.m., while the victims were asleep. If the victim was a single woman, he would subdue her. If it was a couple, he would wake them both with the blinding beam of a flashlight in their eyes. He was always masked, often wearing a simple ski mask or a balaclava. He would force the woman to tie up her husband or boyfriend with shoelaces or other ligatures he had brought with him. Then he would take the man to another room and stack plates or cups on his back, telling him that if he heard the plates rattle, he would kill them both. This was a cruel psychological game, designed to immobilize the male victim with fear and shame. He would then spend hours inside the home with the female victim. The physical assaults were brutal, but the psychological torture was his true signature. He was a man who reveled in terror. He would speak to his victims in a strange, high-pitched, almost whispering hiss, a voice that was both menacing and unnervingly intimate. He would ransack their homes, not just for valuables, but for items of deep personal significance. Wedding rings, photographs, driver's licenses. He was stealing not just their property, but their identities, their sense of security. After the assault, he would often linger in the house, calmly going to the kitchen to eat food from their refrigerator, a final, horrifying act of violation. He would then slip out of the house and disappear back into the suburban night. The East Area Rapist's reign of terror lasted for 3 years, from 1976 to 1979. He committed at least 50 brutal rapes across the Sacramento area and other communities in Northern California. The region was in a state of panic. Gun sales soared. People installed new locks and deadbolts. Neighborhood watch groups were formed. The suburbs, once seen as a safe haven from the dangers of the city, had become a landscape of fear. Every quiet, single-story home was a potential target. Every rustle in the bushes at night could be him. The police investigation was one of the largest in California's history, but they were hunting a ghost. He was forensically aware, rarely leaving behind fingerprints. He was a master of stealth and escape. He seemed to be able to move through backyards and over fences with an almost supernatural ease. The police had hundreds of suspects, thousands of tips, but every lead went cold. They had a vague physical description and a series of composite sketches, but they depicted a generic-looking white male who could have been anyone. In 1979, the East Area Rapist's attacks in Northern California suddenly stopped. Just like the Visalia ransacker before him, he seemed to have vanished. But he had not stopped. He had moved. He had evolved. He traveled south to the sprawling suburbs of Southern California, and it was here that his crimes would escalate from rape to murder. The East Area Rapist was about to become the original Night Stalker, and his final, most deadly reign of terror was just beginning. The phantom who had haunted the quiet neighborhoods of Sacramento had now set his sights on a new hunting ground, and the stakes of the game he was playing were about to become fatal. The sudden cessation of the East Area Rapist's attacks in Northern California in 1979 did not signal the end of his criminal career, but a terrifying metamorphosis. The predator who had honed his skills in stalking, home invasion, and psychological torture was now ready to cross the final, ultimate line. He moved his hunting ground south, to the sun-drenched, affluent coastal communities of Santa Barbara, Ventura, and Orange counties. It was here that he would escalate from rape to murder, earning him a new and chilling moniker from the press: the original Night Stalker. The original was added to distinguish him from the other notorious California serial killer of the 1980s, Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker. His methods remained chillingly consistent, a refined and deadlier version of the pattern he had established in Sacramento. He continued to target couples in middle-class, single-story homes, often near open spaces like canyons or parks that provided an easy escape route. He would still engage in meticulous, weeks-long surveillance of his victims, learning their routines and the intimate details of their lives. He would still make the strange, whispering, hang-up phone calls, a prelude of terror before the attack. But now his attacks ended in murder. The first confirmed murders occurred in Goleta, a suburb of Santa Barbara, in December of 1979. Dr. Robert Offerman and his girlfriend, Dr. Deborah Manning, were found dead in their condominium, shot to death. They had been bound with the same type of ligatures the East Area Rapist had used. The crime scene bore all the hallmarks of his work, but with a new, fatal outcome. A few months later, in March of 1980, another couple in Ventura, Charlene and Lyman Smith, were found murdered in their home. They had been bludgeoned to death with a fireplace log. Charlene had been raped and bound with a specific intricate knot, the diamond knot, which was another of the East Area Rapist's signatures. The killer was now a murderer, and his spree continued. He moved through the sprawling suburbs of Southern California like a phantom, a ghost who brought terror to the quiet, manicured streets. He would go on to commit at least 10 brutal murders between 1979 and 1986. His victims were couples, often attacked and killed together in their own beds, the ultimate violation of their sanctuary. The various police departments in Southern California were, at first, unaware that they were all hunting the same man. The crimes were occurring in different jurisdictions, and the connection to the earlier rape series in Northern California was not immediately made. Each murder was treated as a local, isolated tragedy. It took years for investigators to begin to connect the dots, to see the shared, unique signatures, the stalking, the bindings, the specific knots, the psychological torment that linked these disparate crimes. For decades, the cases were investigated separately. The Visalia ransacker, the East Area Rapist, and the original Night Stalker were believed to be three different, unidentified criminals. The idea that one man could be responsible for such a long and geographically widespread series of crimes, and could evolve his methods from burglary to rape to murder, was almost too prolific and too monstrous to comprehend. The breakthrough that would finally link these three separate criminal careers came not from a police investigation, but from the tireless work of a single, brilliant, and obsessive true crime writer, Michelle McNamara. In the 2000s, McNamara became fascinated with the case of the East Area Rapist. She started a popular blog called True Crime Diary, where she meticulously documented the case, poring over old case files, interviewing retired detectives, and connecting with a community of online sleuths. It was McNamara who first popularized the new, all-encompassing name for the killer, the Golden State Killer. She was convinced that the ransacker, the rapist, and the stalker were all the same man, and she dedicated the final years of her life to proving it. Her work was instrumental in bringing the case back into the national spotlight. She connected the dots in a way that law enforcement had been slow to do, showing how the killer's methods and psychological signatures remained consistent across all three crime sprees. Her obsessive research and her powerful, empathetic writing gave a voice to the victims and created a new, unified narrative for the crimes. She was hunting a ghost, a man who had gotten away with it for decades, and she was determined to give him a name. Tragically, Michelle McNamara died suddenly in 2016, before she could finish her book. But her work was not lost. Her husband, the comedian Patton Oswalt, along with her research partners, completed the book based on her extensive notes and drafts. In 2018, the book, titled I'll Be Gone in the Dark, was published. It became an instant bestseller and a cultural phenomenon. It brought the case of the Golden State Killer to a new, massive audience and put immense public pressure on the law enforcement agencies in California to finally solve the case. The book's publication coincided with a revolutionary new tool in forensic investigation: investigative genetic genealogy. The police now had a weapon that didn't exist during the killer's reign of terror. They had DNA. The killer had been forensically aware, but not perfect. He had left behind DNA evidence at several of the rape and murder scenes. For years, this DNA profile had sat in a database, a genetic ghost with no name attached to it. It had been run against the National Criminal DNA Database, CODIS, thousands of times, but had never produced a match. This meant the killer was not a convicted felon whose DNA was already in the system, but genetic genealogy offered a new way forward. Investigators, led by the Sacramento County District Attorney's Office and a cold case investigator named Paul Holes, decided to use this new technique. They took the killer's DNA profile and uploaded it to a public open-source genealogy website, GEDmatch, the same kind of site that millions of people use to trace their family trees. They were not looking for the killer himself, but for a relative, a distant cousin who had submitted their own DNA to the site. In early 2018, they got a hit. The killer's DNA had a partial match to a handful of other users on the site. They were distant relatives, third and fourth cousins. This was the breakthrough they had been waiting for 40 years. A team of genealogists began the painstaking work of building out the family trees of these distant relatives, looking for the point where the trees intersected. They were essentially building a family tree for the phantom. After months of meticulous work, they traced all the branches of the family tree down to a single promising suspect. He was a man in his 70s who fit the general profile. He was the right age, had lived in the right locations at the right times, and had a background that could fit. The name that emerged from the branches of the family tree was a name that no one had ever suspected. It was not a known criminal or a figure from the underworld. It was the name of a quiet, unassuming man who had lived a seemingly normal life. A former police officer who had been living for decades in a quiet suburb, hiding in plain sight. The ghost who had haunted California for over 40 years was about to get a name, a face, and a final, shocking identity. The hunt for the Golden State Killer was about to come to a stunning and dramatic end. The genetic genealogy investigation had led the cold case team to a single, powerful person of interest, Joseph James DeAngelo, a 72-year-old former police officer living a quiet, retired life in Citrus Heights, a suburb of Sacramento. The name was a shock. DeAngelo had never been on any of the official suspect lists. He was a man who had been living invisibly, a ghost hidden within the very community he had once terrorized. The profile, however, fit with an almost chilling perfection. DeAngelo had been a police officer in two different California jurisdictions, Exeter and Auburn, during the 1970s. His time in Exeter coincided with the Visalia ransacker crime spree. His time in Auburn, just outside Sacramento, coincided with the beginning of the East Area rapist attacks. His police training would have given him an intimate knowledge of investigative techniques, forensic countermeasures, and how to exploit the vulnerabilities of a suburban landscape. He knew how police thought because he was one of them. He was fired from the Auburn Police Department in 1979 for shoplifting a can of dog repellent and a hammer, a petty crime that now seemed like a bizarre footnote to a secret life of monstrous violence. The year he was fired, 1979, was the year the East Area rapist attacks stopped in Northern California, and the original Night Stalker murders began in Southern California. The investigators now had their man, but they needed definitive proof. They needed his DNA to make a direct match to the crime scene evidence. They began a covert surveillance operation on Joseph DeAngelo. They watched his house, followed his movements, and waited for an opportunity to obtain a discarded DNA sample. The first sample they collected, from a tissue left in a trash can, was not enough to create a full profile. They needed more. The final, crucial piece of evidence was obtained from the trash can outside his home. Investigators retrieved a used tissue. They rushed it to the lab. The results came back a short time later. It was a perfect match. The DNA of the quiet, elderly grandfather from Citrus Heights was a direct, undeniable match to the DNA of the monster who had raped and murdered his way across the state of California 4 decades earlier. The phantom finally had a face. On April 24, 2018, more than 40 years after his first known crimes, a team of heavily armed officers descended on the quiet suburban home of Joseph James DeAngelo. The moment of his arrest was surprisingly anticlimactic. The man who had once been a terrifying specter of the night was now just a confused, elderly man in his bathrobe. As he was taken into custody, he reportedly spoke in a soft, almost childlike voice, muttering about a roast he had left in his oven. The contrast between the pathetic old man being arrested and the terrifying, violent predator he had once been was stark and deeply unsettling. The news of his arrest sent a shockwave across the country and around the world. It was a stunning and triumphant moment for law enforcement, a testament to the power of new technology and the dogged persistence of cold case investigators. But for the survivors and the families of the victims, it was a moment of profound and complex emotions. There was relief, a sense that justice was finally, after so long, within reach. There was validation for the victims who had been telling their stories for decades. But there was also a renewed wave of trauma, as the arrest brought all the old nightmares flooding back to the surface. And there was a deep, chilling horror in the realization that the monster who had haunted their lives was not a boogeyman, but a man who had lived a normal life, a man who had been a father, a husband, a police officer. Joseph DeAngelo was initially charged with 13 counts of murder and numerous kidnapping and robbery charges. He was not charged with the dozens of rapes he had committed, as the statute of limitations for those crimes had long since expired. But the evidence from those cases could still be used to establish his pattern of behavior in the murder trials. In June of 2020, to avoid a lengthy and costly trial and the possibility of the death penalty, the now 74-year-old Joseph DeAngelo agreed to a plea deal. In a large ballroom converted into a makeshift courtroom to accommodate the dozens of victims and their families, DeAngelo pleaded guilty to 13 counts of first-degree murder and admitted to dozens of uncharged rapes, burglaries, and other crimes. As part of the plea deal, he had to listen over several days to the testimony of his surviving victims and the family members of those he had murdered. The victim impact statements were a powerful and heartbreaking crescendo to the case. One by one, survivors and their loved ones stood up and faced the man who had destroyed their lives. They spoke of the decades of fear, the paranoia, the lost sense of security, the nightmares, and the enduring trauma. They spoke of the loved ones who were gone, the lives that were cut short. They looked into the vacant eyes of the frail old man sitting in a wheelchair and, for the first time, they were the ones with the power. They were no longer his victims. They were the survivors who had outlasted him. In August of 2020, Joseph James DeAngelo was sentenced to multiple life sentences without the possibility of parole. His reign of terror, which had begun with a ransacking in Visalia in the 1970s, had finally come to an end in a Sacramento courtroom. The case of the Golden State Killer is a landmark in the history of true crime. It is a story about the evolution of a serial predator, a man who, for over a decade, seemed to be an unstoppable force of nature. But it is also a story about the evolution of the fight for justice. It is a testament to the courage of the survivors who never gave up, the dogged determination of investigators like Paul Holes who never let the case go cold, and the brilliant, obsessive work of writers like Michelle McNamara who refused to let the killer remain a phantom. And finally, it is a story about the power of science. The case was ultimately solved not by a confession or a lucky break, but by a tiny fragment of DNA, a genetic ghost that waited patiently for 40 years until the technology was finally advanced enough to give it a name. The Golden State Killer had been hiding, in plain sight, protected by a mask of perfect suburban normalcy. But in the end, his own biology betrayed him, and the secrets that he had kept hidden in the darkness were finally, and irrevocably, brought into the light. The Umbrella Murder. The assassination of Georgy Markov, the Golden State Killer, is a story about a monster who hid behind a mask of suburban normalcy. His reign of terror, a deeply personal violation of his victims' homes and lives. But some crimes are not personal at all. They are cold, calculated, and political. An act of violence where the victim is not an individual but a symbol. This is a story that unfolds not in a quiet cul-de-sac, but on a busy bridge in the heart of London, during the iciest days of the Cold War. It's a story about an assassination so audacious, so strange, and so technologically sophisticated that it seemed to be ripped from the pages of a spy novel. This is the chilling and audacious case of the Umbrella Murder. The story begins with a voice. In the 1970s, Georgy Markov was one of Bulgaria's most celebrated writers and playwrights. He was a prominent member of the nation's intellectual elite. But he grew increasingly disillusioned with the oppressive, totalitarian communist regime that controlled his country. In 1969, while on a trip to Italy, he made the momentous decision to defect to the West. He eventually settled in London, where he found a new and powerful purpose. He began working as a journalist and broadcaster for the BBC World Service and Radio Free Europe. His broadcasts in his native Bulgarian were a thorn in the side of the Bulgarian government. He used his platform to deliver scathing, witty, and insightful critiques of the regime and its leader, Todor Zhivkov. He was not just a critic. He was an insider who had turned against the system, and his words carried immense weight, reaching thousands of his countrymen behind the Iron Curtain. He was, to the Bulgarian secret police, the Državna Sigurnost or DS, a traitor of the highest order, a voice that had to be silenced. By 1978, Markov was acutely aware that he was a marked man. He had received numerous threats. His friends had warned him that the Bulgarian regime had a long reach and a history of dealing with dissidents in a permanent fashion. He knew he was in danger, but he refused to be silenced. On the afternoon of September 7, 1978, Markov was going about his daily routine. He was walking across London's Waterloo Bridge on his way to work at the BBC. It was a normal day, the bridge crowded with commuters and tourists. As he was waiting to cross the street to catch a bus, he felt a sudden, sharp sting in the back of his right thigh. He turned and saw a man behind him fumbling to pick up an umbrella he had just dropped. The man, who had a foreign accent, mumbled, "I'm sorry," then quickly crossed the street, hailed a taxi, and disappeared into the London traffic. Markov felt a dull, aching pain in his leg, but he initially dismissed the incident as a clumsy, unfortunate accident. He assumed the man had simply jabbed him with the tip of the umbrella. He continued on to work, but as the evening progressed, he began to feel increasingly unwell. When he arrived home that night, he had developed a high fever and a dangerously elevated white blood cell count. He told his wife, Annabelle, about the strange incident on the bridge. As his condition rapidly worsened, he was rushed to St. James's Hospital in London. The doctors who treated him were completely baffled. Markov was suffering from a catastrophic septic shock, but they could find no source of infection. His body was shutting down, and none of their treatments were having any effect. He was convinced that he had been poisoned, and he repeated his story about the man with the umbrella to the doctors and to the police from Scotland Yard who were called to his bedside. The police, too, were skeptical. The story seemed fantastical, something out of a pulp spy thriller. It was hard to believe that a sophisticated assassination could have been carried out with an umbrella on a crowded London bridge in broad daylight. But Georgy Markov was insistent. He knew who his enemies were, and he knew they were capable of anything. For 4 days, he fought for his life in the hospital as his organs failed one by one. On September 11, 1978, he died. He was 49 years old. The initial cause of death was listed as blood poisoning from an unknown source. The case could have ended there, a tragic but unexplained medical anomaly. But the detectives at Scotland Yard, prodded by Markov's own certainty and the political context of his life, decided to pursue his strange story. They requested a full and highly detailed autopsy from the government's top forensic pathologists. It was during this autopsy that the case was blown wide open. Deep within the tissue of Markov's right thigh, exactly where he had claimed to have felt the sting, the pathologists found something extraordinary. It was a tiny, metallic sphere, a pellet just 1.7 millimeters in diameter. It was made of a platinum-iridium alloy, a combination of metals used for its density and its resistance to corrosion. The pellet had been drilled with 2 minuscule holes, each just 0.35 millimeters wide, creating a tiny, hollow reservoir in its center. This was not a random piece of shrapnel. This was a piece of sophisticated, miniaturized technology. It was a delivery device designed to carry a payload. The discovery of the pellet was the smoking gun. But it was a gun of a kind the world had never seen before. The investigators now knew that Markov had been telling the truth. He had been shot with this tiny, poison-filled projectile. The next step was to identify the poison. The 2 tiny holes in the pellet were empty, suggesting the substance had been completely absorbed into his bloodstream. Based on the speed and the nature of his symptoms, the high fever, the septic shock, the organ failure, the toxicologists came to a terrifying conclusion. The payload had almost certainly been ricin. Ricin is one of the most potent and deadly toxins known to man. It is a naturally occurring protein derived from the castor bean. It is incredibly lethal. A dose the size of a few grains of salt is enough to kill an adult. It works by destroying the body's cells, preventing them from producing necessary proteins, which leads to a complete systemic collapse. And most critically, there is no known antidote. Once it is in the bloodstream, death is almost certain. The holes in the pellet were coated with a special wax designed to melt at body temperature. The killer had fired the pellet into Markov's leg. The body's heat had then melted the wax, releasing the fatal dose of ricin directly into his system. It was a near-perfect murder weapon. It was small, silent, and could be delivered by a device disguised as an everyday object. The poison it delivered was untraceable by standard toxicological tests and mimicked the symptoms of a natural, albeit severe, illness. It was the work of a state-sponsored assassination program, a weapon designed in the secret labs of an intelligence agency. The investigation took on a new urgency. Scotland Yard now knew they were not just investigating a murder. They were investigating an act of political assassination carried out on British soil by a foreign power. Their suspicions were almost immediately confirmed by another, related case. They learned that just 10 days before the attack on Markov, another Bulgarian dissident, a journalist named Vladimir Kostov, had been attacked in a very similar manner while on the Paris metro. He too had felt a sharp sting and had developed a high fever, but Kostov had survived. French doctors, when they examined him, found an identical platinum iridium pellet embedded in his back. They believed that in his case, the wax seal on the pellet had been damaged or was faulty, and only a small, non-lethal dose of the ricin had been released. The attack on Kostov was the dress rehearsal. The attack on Markov was the flawless execution. The pattern was undeniable. The Bulgarian DS, with the likely assistance and technical expertise of their Soviet counterparts in the KGB, was actively hunting and assassinating its enemies in the heart of Western Europe. The umbrella story, which had at first seemed so fantastic, was now seen as the horrifying truth. The weapon was likely a pneumatic gun, cleverly concealed within the body of a modified umbrella, that could silently fire the tiny, deadly pellet. The case became an international sensation, a real-life spy drama that exposed the brutal and ruthless tactics of the Cold War. The Bulgarian umbrella became a symbol of the sinister, high-tech world of espionage. But knowing how he was killed and who had ordered it was one thing. Finding the man who had actually carried out the assassination on Waterloo Bridge, the man with the foreign accent and the fumbling umbrella, would prove to be an entirely different and far more frustrating challenge. He was a ghost, an operative who had completed his mission and had vanished back behind the Iron Curtain, leaving behind only the memory of a brief, clumsy encounter that was, in fact, a perfect and deadly act of political murder. The confirmation that Georgy Markov had been assassinated with a sophisticated, poison-tipped pellet sent a chill through the halls of Western intelligence. This was not the work of a lone wolf or a criminal syndicate. This was the clear signature of a state-sponsored hit, a bold and public execution carried out on British soil. The investigation, led by Scotland Yard, now faced the immense challenge of unmasking a killer who was almost certainly a trained intelligence operative, protected by the full resources of a hostile foreign government. The primary suspect organization was, without a doubt, the Bulgarian Državna Sigurnost, or DS. The DS was the secret police and intelligence agency of the Communist People's Republic of Bulgaria, and it was notorious for its brutal efficiency and its absolute loyalty to the Soviet KGB. The KGB often used the intelligence services of its satellite states, like Bulgaria, to carry out wet work, assassinations, and other dirty operations in the West. This provided the Soviets with a layer of plausible deniability. The murder of Georgy Markov fit this pattern perfectly. It was a Bulgarian problem, and the DS, with a technical assist from their friends in Moscow, was tasked with solving it. The motive was clear. Markov's broadcasts for Radio Free Europe and the BBC were more than just a nuisance to the Bulgarian regime. They were a genuine threat. He was not just criticizing the government. He was exposing its inner workings, its corruption, and the personal foibles of its dictatorial leader, Todor Zhivkov. He was doing so with wit, intelligence, and the credibility of a former insider. He was undermining the regime's authority and giving hope to dissidents within the country. For a paranoid, totalitarian state, such a voice could not be tolerated. An order was given from the highest levels of the Bulgarian government to neutralize Georgy Markov. The date of the attack, September 7th, was also chillingly significant. It was Todor Zhivkov's birthday. The assassination was, in effect, a grotesque birthday present for the dictator, a demonstration of the DS's loyalty and its long, lethal reach. While the who, in terms of the organization, was clear, finding the individual assassin, the man on the bridge, was a near impossible task. He was a ghost. Scotland Yard had only a vague description from Markov himself. A man of about 40, with a heavy build and a foreign accent. The taxi driver who had picked up a man fitting this description near Waterloo Bridge was located, but he could offer little more. The man had been calm, had spoken little, and had simply been dropped off in the city. He had melted away into the anonymity of London. The investigation became a slow, frustrating process of intelligence gathering. Scotland Yard and MI6 worked together, trying to identify Bulgarian DS agents who were known to be operating in Western Europe at the time. They debriefed other defectors, trying to learn more about the DS's methods and personnel. They knew that the assassin was likely a professional, a member of the DS's elite Service 7, the department responsible for wet work. For over a decade, the case remained officially unsolved. The Cold War continued, and the Iron Curtain remained firmly in place, shielding the perpetrators from Western justice. The Bulgarian government, of course, officially denied any involvement, dismissing the accusations as anti-communist propaganda and slander. The case became a symbol of the ruthless, shadowy nature of the Cold War, a real-life illustration of the kind of plot that John le Carré and Ian Fleming were writing about in their spy novels. The first major breakthrough in the case did not come until after the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 and the subsequent collapse of the communist regimes in Eastern Europe. The end of the Cold War and the opening of formerly secret archives offered the first real opportunity to finally uncover the truth behind Markov's murder. In 1991, the new, democratic government of Bulgaria opened its own investigation and began to declassify the vast, secret files of the DS. What those files revealed was a stunning confirmation of everything the West had suspected. The documents laid out the entire plot in cold, bureaucratic detail. They contained the original order from the Deputy Interior Minister to liquidate Markov. They contained memos discussing the planning of the operation, the acquisition of the poison, and the selection of the agent. The files confirmed that the weapon, the poison delivery system, had been provided by the KGB's infamous Laboratory 12, their secret division for poisons and chemical weapons. The collaboration was clear. The files also provided a name for the suspected assassin. The prime suspect identified in the documents was an Italian-born Danish citizen named Francesco Gallino, who used the code name Piccadilly. Gallino was a small-time criminal who had been recruited by the DS in the 1970s. He was a smuggler and a drifter, a man with no firm allegiances, which made him a perfect, deniable asset. The files indicated that he had been activated for the mission in 1978 and had traveled to London just before the assassination. Armed with this new information, investigators from Britain and the newly democratic Bulgaria tracked down Francesco Gallino. They found him living a quiet life in Copenhagen, Denmark. In 1993, he was arrested by the Danish police and interrogated for several hours by a team of Danish and British detectives. They confronted him with the evidence from the DS files. Gallino admitted to having worked for the Bulgarian Secret Service, but he steadfastly denied any involvement in the Markov assassination. He claimed he was in London at the time, but only as a low-level smuggler. The interrogation was intense, but Gallino was a cool and practiced liar, without a direct confession, and with the physical evidence being purely circumstantial after so many years, the authorities did not have enough to charge him. He was released. After his release, Gallino vanished once more, allegedly moving to Austria, where he is believed to have died in 2021. The man believed to be the killer on the bridge had, like a true phantom, slipped through the grasp of justice one last time. The investigation also focused on the high-ranking Bulgarian officials who had ordered the hit. The former head of the DS, General Vladimir Todorov, was put on trial in Bulgaria for his role in destroying the files related to the Markov case. He was convicted of obstruction of justice, but the generals who gave the actual order were either dead or were protected by their old political connections. The full chain of command was never brought to justice. The case of the umbrella murder is a chilling example of the lengths to which a totalitarian state will go to silence its critics. It demonstrates the cold, bureaucratic, and international nature of state-sponsored assassination. Georgy Markov was not killed in a fit of passion. He was eliminated as a matter of policy. His death was planned in Sofia, the weapon was designed in Moscow, and the act was carried out by a deniable foreign agent on a busy street in London. The case also stands as a testament to the power of a single, courageous voice. Markov knew he was a target. He knew the risks he was taking every time he sat down in front of a BBC microphone. But he believed that telling the truth about the regime that had crushed his country was more important than his own personal safety. He was killed for his words, a fact that makes him a martyr for the cause of free speech. The iconic weapon, the Bulgarian umbrella, has become a lasting symbol of the Cold War's sinister ingenuity. It represents a world where even the most mundane objects could be turned into deadly weapons, where a simple, clumsy encounter on a crowded bridge could be a meticulously planned act of murder. The tiny platinum iridium pellet, now housed in Scotland Yard's Black Museum, is a chilling artifact from that secret war. A war that was fought not just with tanks and missiles, but with poison, deception, and a sharp, sudden sting in the leg. The killer may have gotten away with it, but the story of Georgy Markov and the umbrella that killed him serves as a permanent, chilling reminder of the ultimate price of dissent. The release of Francesco Piccadilly Galino in 1993 was, for all practical purposes, the end of the line for the criminal investigation into the murder of Georgy Markov. The prime suspect had been identified, located, and questioned, but the evidence, after 15 years, was too circumstantial to secure a conviction in a court of law. The masterminds of the plot in Bulgaria were shielded by their past power and the convenient destruction of the most damning files. The case became a frustrating monument to a crime where the culprits were known, but justice was unattainable. However, the story did not end there. In the years that followed, investigative journalists and historians continued to dig, and new details and confessions emerged from the shadows of the fallen Soviet bloc, painting an even clearer picture of the conspiracy. One of the most significant revelations came from a former high-ranking KGB general named Oleg Kalugin. In the years after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Kalugin became a prominent critic of the old regime and began to speak openly about his time in the KGB. In several interviews and in his memoirs, Kalugin confirmed, without reservation, the KGB's direct involvement in the Markov assassination. He stated that the Bulgarian leader, Todor Zhivkov, had personally requested assistance from the then head of the KGB, Yuri Andropov, in dealing with the dissident problem. According to Kalugin, the KGB was initially hesitant to get directly involved in an assassination on British soil, fearing the diplomatic fallout. But Zhivkov was insistent. Kalugin claimed that the KGB agreed to provide the technical means for the assassination but insisted that the operation itself be carried out by the Bulgarian DS. Kalugin described how the KGB's secretive Laboratory 12 had developed the poison delivery system. He confirmed that the weapon was not necessarily an umbrella, but could have been disguised as any number of everyday objects, like a pen or a walking stick. The umbrella story, he suggested, became famous simply because that is what Markov saw and reported. The KGB provided the weapon and the poison, and they trained the Bulgarian agent, whom he confirmed was codenamed Piccadilly, in its use. Kalugin's confession from the highest levels of the KGB provided the final, missing link, confirming the international conspiracy that Western intelligence had long suspected. Further details emerged from Oleg Gordievsky, another high-level KGB defector. Gordievsky claimed that the order to kill Markov was a direct result of Markov's broadcasts about a series of lavish parties and corrupt dealings within Zhivkov's inner circle. Markov's reporting was not just politically damaging. It was personally embarrassing to the dictator, a slight that could not be forgiven. These post-Cold War revelations have provided a moral and historical certainty to the case, even if legal justice was never achieved. We now know, with a high degree of confidence, the full story. A vain and brutal dictator, angered by a dissident's words, requested a hit from his powerful Soviet patrons. The KGB, acting as the Q branch of this real-life spy drama, provided the sophisticated, untraceable weapon, and the Bulgarian DS, acting as the field agents, used a deniable foreign operative to carry out the murder on a London bridge. The case of Georgy Markov had a lasting and profound impact on the world of intelligence and counterintelligence. It served as a wake-up call to Western security services about the sophistication and brazenness of the Eastern Bloc's assassination programs. The use of a biological toxin like ricin, delivered by a miniaturized, clandestine device, represented a new and terrifying frontier in covert warfare. The Bulgarian umbrella became a legendary case study, taught at spy schools around the world, a perfect example of how to execute a deniable political assassination. The legacy of the case also extends to the world of medicine and toxicology. The discovery of the ricin pellet in Markov's body was a major event in forensic science. It forced coroners and toxicologists to consider the possibility of exotic, state-sponsored poisons when dealing with mysterious deaths, particularly those of politically sensitive individuals. For the family of Georgy Markov, particularly his widow, Annabelle, the decades following his death were a long and tireless quest for the truth. Annabelle Markov became a fierce advocate, working with journalists and investigators to keep the case alive and to pressure the Bulgarian government to come clean. While she never saw the men who killed her husband stand trial, her efforts were instrumental in ensuring that the truth of the conspiracy was eventually brought to light. She ensured that his legacy would not just be that of a victim of a bizarre murder, but that of a writer and a freedom fighter who was killed for the power of his words. Today, the story of the Umbrella Murder remains one of the most iconic and chilling episodes of the Cold War. It is a stark reminder of a time when the world was divided into two armed camps, and a secret, shadow war was being fought in the streets and alleys of major Western cities. It was a war where the weapons were not just bombs and tanks, but also poisons, secrets, and lies. The fate of Francesco Galino, the man known as Piccadilly, is a frustrating final chapter. After his release, he lived the rest of his life as a free man, a ghost who had successfully completed his mission and escaped justice. His story is a testament to the effectiveness of using deniable, third-party agents for such operations. He was a small-time criminal who, for a brief moment, became a player in a game of geopolitical chess, an assassin whose name is now forever linked to one of the most famous assassinations in history. The case stands as a powerful symbol of the battle between the power of the state and the power of the individual voice. The Bulgarian regime, with all its resources, its secret police, and its backing from the Soviet Union, was able to silence Georgy Markov's physical voice, but they were not able to silence his story. In death, he became even more powerful. His murder exposed the brutal, paranoid, and criminal nature of the regime he fought against, and it contributed to its eventual downfall. The man with the umbrella may have won the battle on Waterloo Bridge, but Georgy Markov, the dissident writer, ultimately won the war. His story is a permanent, chilling testament to the fact that you can kill a man, but you cannot kill an idea, especially when that idea is the simple, powerful truth.